everybody, and welcome back for another edition of the Christian Contrarian. I'm Gary Wayne, author of the Genesis 6 Conspiracy, and this is episode 35, The Serpent Seed, Part 3, the Nachash and Satan. I'm thinking you might find that this is going to be the more simpler and obvious section to the three-part series I'm doing on the serpent seed from a literal perspective and to be understood from a literal perspective, because all of the details that I've talked about in part 1 and part 2 come together in such an obvious nature to what the end of the narrative says in Genesis 3 and the implications thereof are. So just as a quick review, we reviewed in section 1, we reviewed Genesis 4, and that the lineages were together. There's no separation of the lineages, and then you get the full lineage of Seth in chapter 5, but Enos and Seth are listed in chapter 4. And in chapter 3, we went into the detail of the story in terms of the allegory and or selecting the right meaning, just as we needed to select the right meaning in chapter 4 with how Cain came about in terms of his birth, and understanding that there's a consistency to the application of those selections of the words that need to be used so that you don't put the narrative in contradiction. And what we found in part 1 and part 2 of the series is that selecting another meaning for a Hebrew word can be done, but you have to be careful, otherwise it now becomes in conflict with the rest of the narrative and other scripture. And we're going to continue on that today as we talk about Nachash and Satan. So we're going to focus in on some meanings of some words again, as we've done in the last 2 parts. But we're going to be really focusing on sort of the outcome that makes things, I think, crystal clear. And I'm hoping you find it will as well. So let's start with the Nachash. And the Nachash is from the Hebrew word, for serpent. And that's 5172. And simply said, in terms of its definition, Nachash means serpent and or snake, just as it's translated in most English translations as serpent. And it is rooted in another word that means to hiss, and meaning enchanter and diviner. And so it's kind of important to understand that this is a physical sort of being, and it's into the mystical arts and is subject to the polytheist religions and the fallen angels as they distributed their religion right from the beginning on the earth to all peoples of the earth. And all of that's going to be very, very important. And the word serpent is used in Genesis 3:1, 3:2, 3:4, 13, and 14. And of course, as we get into the serpent seed in 3:15. So it's important to understand who this player is, and we flesh it out as being a serpent or a snake. But it's a different kind of snake at this point in time when the serpent or the Nachash is talking to Eve in the Garden of Eden. And in Genesis 3:1, we learn that it's a talking serpent. And it's an intelligent serpent. And it's a being. And it's distinct from Satan. And in the meaning, we don't even get Satan being linked to being this specific Satan, this specific being. And so there is no allegory even that we can use in Genesis 3 to overlay Satan as being the Nachash. That now becomes a little bit more obvious as we get into some more of the descriptions of what the Nachash is all about. So as we move into the word first word that is really being, or the second word that's probably being used in the verse to be accurate, is the word subtle. And I want to focus on that because that's kind of the intelligence aspect of this being. And I want people to understand it's not what we think of snakes and serpents as of today. And that's an important outcome of what happens in Genesis 3. So subtle is the word arum, and it means to be prudent, cunning, shrewd, and crafty. So just as in Job 5:12 and 15:5, you're going to find the word crafty, and it's going to go back to arum. And so what we understand is that this being was very intelligent and very cunning or crafty, not necessarily sexy. There's nothing to be said about the Nachash that's going to have anything to do with sex. And that's going to be, again, a common sort of principle that we're going to continue with as we progress in this chapter today. And what we're told in 3:1 is that the Nachash, or the serpent, is a beast, not an angel, although you can make a case that the beast empires or the beast antichrist are associated with angelic beings. I think it's perfectly fine to say that there's an association, just as a Nachash is an enchanter or diviner and is the most subtle of the beasts of the field. I think it was a follower and a co-conspirator with Satan to bring down humankind. And again, we're going to talk a little bit more about that. And so beast comes from a very interesting word that has a few really important meanings to it. So again, we have to ensure we're applying the right application for the narrative so that there isn't any contradictions. So that's the Hebrew word che, or hey, depending on how you want to pronounce that. Hebrew, or technically in how we pronounce a CH in English. And so that is the word life as it's used over 200 times, whether it's life or living or livest, all those different ones. It's probably going to come out to like 350 times just on a quick sort of count on that. But it can also mean beast, as in that animal, physical creature thing. So you've got a few different meanings, and we have to be careful that we're translating properly. So the narrative says the Nachash is a beast of the field. So it's alive, obviously, so you could apply that word to it. But when we dig a little bit deeper, I think they're tied together, but it's more beast and creature that we want to pull out of this thing. Not an angelic being, but a physical animal of the field. And of course, field is a Hebrew word that means of the country, of the flat country, of the ground, of the earth, not of heaven. Okay, so now when we start tying this back in, is that you've got in Genesis 1:20 and 30, you've got a creature of life being created. So when we look at life, that's che, and creature is also che. Or I'm not sorry, no, that's not quite right, but life is che, but it's a creature of life. And in Genesis 1:30, it actually is used as a creature of life. And in 1:30, we also get beast of life. So we got creature of life, beast of life, as it's talked about in Genesis 1:20 and 1:30. So this is an animal that's a living creature, but it's not an angelic creature. It's certainly not Satan in these types of descriptions. And beast is used 76 times, and all for the similar type of application, as in that physical earthly realm creature. And in Genesis 3:1, it's a beast of the field, so a beast of the earth. And this is the same type of beast and application that you're going to get in Genesis 7:14 and 7:21 for the recreation or the replenishing of the earth after the flood, with all these different kinds of animals. So I think when we look at the meanings of the term beast of the field, that is talking about a physical creature that was walking, talking, intelligent, and a role that is not really defined in the Bible as to what position that this creature had. But because it's a serpent kind of being, just as Satan is a serpent as described in Revelation 12, and I'm going to come back to that, I think it's probably a favored being of Satan and the seraphims. And I think that leads to, and maybe favored in terms of in charge of things on the earth. But whatever the case is, it's a reptilian being as we understand it, that is loyal to Satan and the fallen angels and the downfall of humankind. And so in Genesis 3:14, after the deception, after the fall of Eve, we learn that it's going to lose its attributes as a punishment. So it loses its legs, it loses its arms or its wings, it loses its intelligence. It loses its ability to speak, and it's going to be forced to crawl on the ground. So it's the Nachash that all of this happens to, and all of its different various forms all around the earth. Now, this doesn't happen to Satan. So if the punishment for having sex as the serpent's seed goes was Satan having sex with Eve, then why wouldn't he be punished? But he's not. We're going to come back to Satan in a few minutes. So that's a very, again, as I say, we're going to talk about some of the outcomes. And that outcome just doesn't fit with the idea of sex. But it does fit with the idea that there was this intelligent being before the fall that beguiled Eve because it was subtle. And so in Genesis 3:13, Eve is saying that she was deceived by the serpent, by this intelligent being, and that she was beguiled. And that's the word Nachash. And that means to be deceived, led astray, seduced, but seduced morally. Never is the word Nachash for beguile ever used in the Bible in a literal sense to seduce sexually. In the King James Version Bible, the only other words, whether it's seduced, comes from the Hebrew word ta, which also means to cause to go astray. So even though you can use an English understanding of seduce and sex, just as that's one of the basis of the serpent seeds with some of the fruit and the different allegories that they're trying to overlay with a different meaning than what the actual literal narrative says, there's no connection to sex there whatsoever. And that's important because the serpent beguiled Eve, did not have sex with her. And how did the Nachash beguile or deceive Eve? And he said, well, if you eat from the tree that has the fruit of the knowledge of both good and evil, you will not die, but you'll be like gods. And the two pillars for godhood in the polytheist system is that you would have unlimited knowledge and you would have immortality. And in the garden, they had to access Adam and Eve to the tree of life, as we talked about in part 2. And so the deception is yes, they became knowing. They became knowing of good and evil and probably additional knowledge, and that an aspect like God's. But the consequence for Adam and Eve, just as there was a consequence for the serpent for deceiving Eve in eating this fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, was that Adam and Eve lost access to the tree of life, which Satan would have known and would have probably advised the Nachash accordingly. And so when they lose access to the tree of life, that's the downfall of Adam and Eve as a consequence by breaking the only law, one rule given to them of not eating from the tree, even though they can eat of all of the other trees of the garden. Even in the Garden of Eden, that was the one they couldn't. They couldn't break. And the consequence was the fall, and we've seen the play out of that through our history. That's going to be fully resolved through the end time and after the millennium. Now, let's move on to Adam. Now that we know that there isn't really any sex going on between Nachash and Eve by the literal narrative and by the meanings of the word applied properly coming out of Hebrew, God goes to Adam and asks, why he's hiding. And in 3:6, we learn that Adam ate from the tree as Eve did, who gave him the fruit to eat. Okay, so Eve ate of the fruit, Adam ate of the fruit. And then in verse 7, both of their eyes were open. So this seems to be happening very close together. And in 3:11, God asks Adam if he ate from the tree. And Adam says in verse 12, he did. That he actually ate from the tree as Eve did, which is a very important deal. Very important wording. So if he ate of the tree in the serpent seed as a sexual act, as the serpent seed doctrine proposes, and did it the same way as verse 12 talks about, then that means Adam would have had sex with either Satan or the Nachash. And we're not told that. In fact, that's just totally overlooked. So you can't apply one allegory to one and not apply it to the other. So it has to work together. And the only one that works together is that this was not a sexual act. This was being deceived to disobey God, to be like gods. And they ate physically from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil that they were forbidden to do. And as a consequence, they were banned from Eden. So I don't know how we could get more obvious on that unless you want to go down that road, but that's a road that we get no other details in Scripture on, that Adam would have had sex with Satan or with the Nachash. So I think that in itself, along with so many other things that we've talked about in this series, all points towards the literal wording as it's understood in the standard dogma for Eve and Adam ate of the tree. They didn't have sex with Satan or the Nachash. So let's move over to Satan now. So Satan is recorded in Revelation 12:9 as a serpent and as a dragon and as the devil and as Satan. All those names apply to his degraded format as Satan. And a serpent and a dragon are essentially the same thing. It's a flying dragon, or a flying serpent is a dragon. And typically that's understood, or at least I would understand certain was in part seraphim, as seraphim are recorded in Isaiah 6, six-winged angels. And that would give him a serpent type of form, with the serpent face, as seraph is defined as. He's also a cherubim in Ezekiel 28 who walked amongst the fiery stones. And cherubims don't do that. They only fan and cover the throne for God. But the seraphim, as described in Isaiah 6, work in those fiery stones in the altar before God in a priest-type capacity. And I think Satan was probably a priest-like character, just as Ezekiel describes his role, and combined with Isaiah 14, we get this description including the jewels that seems to be the number of 9 and less of the Levite tribes, but sort of as a vest that would be worn to prepare to be used as the high priest before God. And that's how far Satan fell, but I'm digressing here. So we're also learning in Ezekiel 28:13 that this anointed cherubim was in Eden. Not necessarily in his seraphic form, but he was in Eden. Maybe he was in his seraphic form. We don't know. But he's both cherubim, high priest, and he's also seraphim, which all makes sense as we look at Isaiah 6. And Satan would have had many titles. It just shows how far he fell. And so we don't get the word seraph showing up at all in the wording in the Garden of Eden. The only time we get seraph showing up other than in Isaiah 6 is in combination with a fiery serpent. So a seraph Nachash, as opposed to just serpent being used alone. And typically that's going to denote a seraphim or a seraphim image as it's applied in Numbers 21:6, Deuteronomy 8:15, Isaiah 14:29 and 36. So when you see fiery serpent in English, that is seraph Nachash, which is, I think, describing either an image on earth, probably an image on earth of an angelic being. So a physical nature to the serpent that has wings and a serpent face as a god or a watcher or a seraphim angel. So if that makes sense then to you, then know that the Hebrew seraph or cherubim is not used, either one, in Genesis 3. So we don't really know what form Satan took. But Nachash is always used alone. So there's no seraphim, serpent type of additional overlay to suggest that this was more than just a physical being, is my point on that. But Satan, who was in Eden, because we know as cherubim he was probably in Eden, he was there probably coaching one of his favored beings, and maybe most favored beings of all of the creations of days through 4 through 6, or as an avatar with the Nachash being his avatara. And we know Satan can do that because he enters Judas in the New Testament to help Judas get over the hump of deceiving and betraying Jesus. So you get a similar sort of understanding that could possibly have happened. But Satan, as I said, did not lose his arms or his intelligence or his legs. So he was not the one that was talking to him, unless he was just helping him or coaching. I'm fine with either. And Satan was not the one who was sent to the abyss, like other angels were, for sexually creating a Nephilim. I mean, he will be in Revelation 20 for 1,000 years before going to the lake of fire, whereas the fallen angels seem to be more in the abyss, who are impassioned and will go to the lake of fire at the end time. Satan is a little bit more delayed, but he's not automatically thrown into the abyss. So one wonders, did he actually have sex with them? Probably not, because seemingly all the angels who had sex with human females and created and destroyed the laws of creation, violated them at least, were put into the abyss. And here's the thing. If the Nephilim in Genesis 6 were giants, and they were, in the Rephaim, however, they show up were giants and would obviously be either survivors from the flood or recreated after the flood, and I think more likely recreated in a second incursion after the flood because they're distinct somehow and not as big and a whole bunch of other things, then that means Cain would have to be a giant as well. But he's not described as that anywhere in the Bible. He is described as the third branch of Adam and Eve, just as we talked about in part 1. So you have branch Cain, branch Abel, which stops there, and branch Seth, which continues to the flood and after, and Cain seemingly stops with the flood. So 3 branches as the offspring of Cain, but nowhere do we see him or his offspring suggested to be giants, although Gnostics will make that case. But we can't find that anywhere scripturally. So those outcomes suggest that Satan did not have sex with Eve. And when we look at the word seed, as in Genesis 3:15, and the wording that's going on in Genesis 3:15, you have the seed of the serpent and Eve, her seed and his seed. They're separate seeds. And that's important to understand, that there's two separate seeds going forward. And now I think because of what I've talked about here, that Genesis 6 with the seraphim watchers fulfills the serpent seed moving forward. But Eve has her own seed, as we've talked about in the generations in Genesis 3 or Genesis 4 and Genesis 5. But what's important here is that word seed is the word zera, which means fruit, plant, child, offspring, and allegorically understood as offspring and child as it's applied. And we see that in Genesis 4:25. The seed of Adam and Eve came together and they had Seth. So Seth is the seed, the offspring. And they're used together. Both Adam and Eve produce and conceive Seth, and Seth is the seed. But in Genesis 3:15, we get her seed and his seed individually. They're not together. So they're describing something different than an act in the Garden of Eden. And if they were together, it would say that, her seed and his seed together. And we know Cain had the spirit of Satan, but not physically, seemingly as an offspring of Satan. Or if we wanted to look at it and say, okay, if Nachash was the one who deceived Eve as a physical being, and this is the serpent seed, we're suggesting then that a serpent being, physical being, had sex with Eve. Again, we don't get any of that afterwards in the Bible to give us any more information, and we're making a bit of a leap to make that case. So when we look at the Nachash having sex, that just doesn't fit with the narrative or the rest of Scripture again. And as we look at how this fits in terms with some of the New Testament versions, it sort of breaks down in two different sort of cases. One would be sort of the lineage. And in Jude 1:14, proponents of the serpent seed will say, well, it says seventh generation. And if you count the generations, you're using Adam and Cain and then inserting Seth, then you're going to get 8. And that number's not right. Well, again, that's not quite accurate. Number one is that Luke 3:37 and 38 recants the same lineage as in Genesis 5. And where the misdirection comes from is the first generation includes 3 that are listed. You have Cain, Abel, and Seth. And then other siblings of Seth and Cain come later. And then the next generation, as it breaks up, you have Enoch as son of Cain, which is the 3rd generation, and then Enos, son of Seth. So the numbers as you insert Seth behind Adam, they add up to 7. It makes perfect sense. But if you wanted to manipulate it, you would say, well, that's another generation, but it's not. It's the same generation as Cain. And when we look at other applications in the New Testament, particularly people like to use John 8, that saying that serpent's the father of the Israelites. Well, Jesus clearly says that they are the offspring of Abraham. And then we have the lineages that go back all the way to Seth. So you would have to say that there is a corruption of the Bible to come to that sort of conclusion. Jesus is talking to them as being the servants of Satan in terms of not following the laws and the spirit of the laws. So they're following the spirit of Cain. So when you hear about all of the different references to that serpent seed proponents will look for, you have to understand that the serpent seed coming out of Genesis 3:15 is physical and spiritual. And the New Testament is essentially talking about this spiritual sons of Cain. just as when we're going to be resurrected, we will be spiritual sons of God, adopted through our brother Jesus. And so anytime you see references to the New Testament, look for that metaphor that is now trying to be transposed into a physical genealogy, but we just don't get that. Now, I have put together the first part into a document. I will be putting part 2 and part 3 into documents. So if somebody wants the full series of documents, get a hold of me. I won't have them all done by the time you see this show, but I will over the next few weeks. So I'll make a list and I will send all of them out. So until next time, everybody, please stay healthy, please stay safe, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks.